In this video, we begin our discussion on Chapter 11, in which we go over the characteristics of an oligopoly, where, looking ahead, currently we are examining different market structures in order to put product demand and product supply together, in order to examine price and output determination, where thus far we've seen competitive markets lead to a higher amount of output at a reduced price point in equilibrium compared to that of the monopoly market structure. Our second objective will be to examine profits and consumer surplus, where we've seen that the competitive market structure leads to a higher amount of consumer surplus in equilibrium compared to that of the monopoly market structure, but we've seen that the monopoly market structure leads to a higher amount of economic profits in equilibrium compared to that of the competitive market structure. And lastly, we seek to examine the role for government intervention, where, given a particular market structure, how does its price and output level look in equilibrium, as well as the amount of consumer surplus and firm profit levels, and is there any need to change any of those variables? So then with that in mind, in this chapter, we seek to introduce our third market structure in the form of oligopolies, in which we'll do so by going over some characteristics of oligopolies in order to go over the profit maximization process for an oligopolist, and then conclude with market outcomes, where in today's discussion on oligopoly characteristics, we will do so by setting up some preliminaries in order to go over characteristics and conclude with examples. Where, as we saw with prior market structures, in order to study the oligopoly market structure, we will need two things. The first being the firm problem, maximize profits subject to the production constraint, and the second being the market structure assumption, or in this case it's going to be oligopolies, therefore we'll need the characteristics of an oligopoly. Or recall that market structure is simply the number and relative size of firms in an industry. Where, looking at our two items again briefly, we saw that with the theory of the firm, merely with the firm problem, we can examine the firm's production process as well as their cost structure. In that, below we have our short-run production function. We've seen that with a fixed amount of capital and a variable amount of labor, we can see how much output is being produced by a particular firm. And through the production process, what costs are being incurred in terms of their variable costs, what are they paying in terms of their fixed capital, what's the rate of change, as well as what is the average cost structure. And by imposing the market structure assumption, we then saw that we could determine the pricing strategy for a particular firm, allowing us to go through the profit maximizing behavior process, and then conclude this by going over the market outcome, in which we did this for the competitive market as well as for the monopoly, in which we have the competitive market below, on the left and in the middle, and on the right we have the profit maximization process as well as market outcome for a monopoly. Now, so then what we have then is, without the market structure assumption, is we cannot complete our analysis for the firm or the market. Therefore, as we did with our prior two market structures, we need to define oligopoly in order to examine its characteristics, which will then allow us to go for the profit maximization process for an oligopolist, and then conclude by examining equilibrium for the market. Where, before proceeding to characteristics, let us first recall our market structures, where our base case is perfect competition, in which there's many buyers and sellers, each of which with no market power. This sits at an extreme in which it's not very realistic in terms of what we are likely to encounter in the real world. And our second market structure is monopolies, in that there's one firm in the space with a considerable amount of market power, and this sits at the other end of extremes, in that this is not very realistic in terms of what we're likely to encounter in the real world. That's not to say that perfect competition and monopoly don't exist. It's just it's not the most common form of market structure that we are to encounter. So then, with our two extremes considered, we then now seek to turn our attention towards monopolistic competition, oligopolies, and duopolies, which sit somewhere between these two extremes and are more likely to be encountered in the real world, where we observe that all of these are deviations from our base case in terms of perfect competition, in terms of what happens to when we start relaxing or tightening some of the assumptions of perfect competition, what does that do to the market outcome in terms of output and price in equilibrium, and what does that do to consumer surplus and economic profit levels as a result, and that's what we seek to observe. And with monopolistic competition and downwards, we do observe that one assumption that's being changed is the amount of firms in the space, in that we see that as firms is changing, as well as we see that there is a differentiation in terms of market power. As less firms are in the space, market power is increasing, where we see that this is going to be an inverse relationship between the two, and firms in the space will be a determinant of that. In terms of these in-between market structures, the first that we seek to consider is the oligopoly market structure, in which we'll see shortly is going to be a few firms in the space with a considerable amount of market power. Where let us now turn our attention towards oligopolies, where an oligopoly is going to be a market in which a few firms produce all or most of the market supply for a good or service, where the conditions for a monopoly to hold are going to be there's a few firms operating in the space whom exhibit profit maximizing behavior, selling a standardized product in which barriers to entry exist such that these firms have market power. Where, looking at these characteristics individually, a few firms is going to be a classification assumption in which there's a few firms operating in a space that are large relative to the size of the market, where we can measure the size of these firms in terms of the concentration ratio, which is going to be the proportion of total industry output produced by the largest firms, typically by the 4 largest, where an example of calculating the concentration ratio is if we consider the computer industry, whom produces 1 million units or 1 million computers, and the 4 largest firms in the space produce 700,000 computers in the space, then the concentration ratio for these 4 firms is 70%, given that these 4 firms produce 700,000 units. Dividing that by overall units, which is 1 million in the space, that gives us 70%. And in terms of classifying markets in terms of oligopolies, a concentration ratio of 60% or higher is what will constitute an oligopoly. If we do this for a group of firms, we can also do this for individual firms by considering their market share, where a market share is going to be the percentage of total market produced by a single firm. Where, continue our example of the computer industry, if a single firm in the space is producing 500,000 units of the 1 million units that are being produced, the market share of this individual firm is 50%, given that 500,000 units by the single firm divided by 1 million units overall in the space gives us 50%, where we will expect and we will see that firms will be very protective over their market share. Our second assumption is what we saw in our prior market structures, in that we are just importing our assumption on firm behavior, in that they maximize profits subject to the production constraint, such that they will maximize profits at the rate of marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, given that this is the objective of the firm. We could also, as we did with our prior market structure assumptions, or market structures, is import our consumer behavior as well, in that we assume rational consumers that maximize utilities subject to the budget constraints at the rate of the marginal rate of substitution is equal to that of the price ratio. In terms of our third assumption, a standardized product, this is a relaxation of our perfect competition assumption of a identical good. With a standardized product, each firm produces a good that is substitutable for one another, in that it's a common good with differentiation across brands, where this differentiation can be in features, where this then allows for some differences in the production process, given different features, so different things need to be produced using a different combination of labor and capital, which then also means some variance in the cost structure across these firms as well. And a consequence of different features in terms of the product as well is consumers developing loyalty for a particular brand given these features. Where one example in terms of a common good that's substitutable for one another would be Coca-Cola and Pepsi, in which both fulfill the role as a soft drink, but they vary in terms of taste as well as how they are branded. And likewise, a second assumption or a second example will be Fruity Pebbles and Cheerios in terms of fulfilling the role as cereal, but they vary in taste and branding as well, where Fruity Pebbles are rather sweet, Cheerios are rather bland. Fruity Pebbles are likely to be targeted in terms of the youth, in terms of advertising, whereas Cheerios will be more neutral in terms of its branding and more accessible for everybody. Now, in terms of barriers to entry, this is going to be our fourth assumption, and we're going to assume that high barriers to entry exist in the market, making it difficult for new firms to enter, which is a relaxation of our assumption of no barriers to entry from perfect competition, in which if profits were observed in perfect competition, new firms could then enter the space easily, taking up some of those profits, where barriers to entry we define once again as obstacles that make it difficult or impossible for firms to enter into a market, where some examples include patents, control over input resources, acquisition, government regulation, and some new ones, non-price competition in the form of advertising, in terms of the more a consumer knows about a product, the more likely they are to purchase from a particular brand. If they do not know about a particular product from a brand, they cannot make that purchase if they do not know it exists. And this furthers on in terms of brand loyalty, which is a new barrier to entry that we're seeing. And that with brand loyalty, a consumer will repeatedly purchase from a particular producer, regardless of a new producer entering into the space, due to the product differentiation, which then creates an inelastic response in terms of the price elasticity of demand. New barriers to entry also include training, in that if producing a particular product requires a labor-intensive process, this will require a lot of training from the new employees, such that this incurs a high amount of cost, or this high amount of costs will be a barrier to entry for a firm trying to enter into the space. And the last new barrier to entry that we're introducing will be network economies, in that if a good becomes very widespread in use, it becomes more valuable to consumers, which then means it will make substitutes less accessible, such that the existing product is the one that needs to be used. And so consumers will have relatively less choice in terms of what they can use to fulfill the role of the particular good in question. So then with that in mind, our last assumption will be market power, in that dominant firms in the space will have market power or the ability to alter market price, where we saw that this is a consequence of the amount of firms in the space, and also due to the availability of substitutes in terms of the good, but also other determinants will include barriers to entry, as we saw with the case of the monopoly, in which that with high barriers to entry, they were the single firm in the space, giving them a considerable amount of market power, and an additional determinant will be market share for each firm, which also gives us the intuition as to why the firms are going to be protective over their market share, as this is what helps determine their overall market power in the space. So then, with our characteristics and definition in mind, an oligopoly is a market structure that sits between the extremes of perfect competition and monopolies in terms of market structures. As a result, it is more common in terms of what we'll observe in the real world, alongside monopolistic competition, which we'll study in the next chapter, where in regards to some markets that we can constitute as an oligopoly, as we've seen in terms of perfect competition, agricultural markets as well as eBay constitute perfect competition, and we're to classify oligopolies, in which we see many firms operating in the space, selling an identical product in which there's no market power, so our characteristics are being violated in terms of what constitutes an oligopoly. In terms of soft drinks, there's only a few amount of firms in the space, such as Coca-Cola and Pepsi. They sell a differentiated good. The firms have a considerable amount of market power, and there's high barriers to entry in terms of startup costs. So we would expect that soft drink industry to hold in terms of assumptions for an oligopoly. Likewise, in terms of cell phone providers, there's only a handful of firms in the space, such as Verizon and T-Mobile, and other firms operating in the space will include AT&T as well as Sprint. And in terms of startup costs, they'll be quite high, so this will also create a barrier of entry for the new firms. There's some differentiation in terms of what these providers are carrying, and this will then constitute them as an oligopoly as a result. The electricity market will not hold in terms of an oligopoly, given that there's only a single firm operating in the space that's sanctioned by the government. So then, with only a single firm operating in the space, this will then violate our characteristics of an oligopoly. And the last example that we have here is the auto industry, where in terms of firms, there's only a handful in the space, such as GM, Toyota, Ford, and Chrysler. It's once again pretty pricey in terms of trying to start up and produce cars. Each of these firms have a considerable amount of market power. There's some differentiation in terms of the types of cars that they are selling. And so overall, we would expect that the characteristics of an oligopoly to hold. And so 3 examples that we have then are the auto industry, cell phone providers, and the soft drink market in terms of oligopolies. So then, with our definition and characteristics in place and some examples, where we'll proceed in our next video is going through the profit maximizing behavior of an oligopolist.